Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this great conversation. I'm James Michalowski with the Hunt Institute, and we're really excited today to be speaking with Dr. Carol D'Amico from the Strada Education Network, Sarah Saddlemeyer from the Pew Charitable Trust, and Tina Gridiron from the ACT Center for Equity and Learning. We're really excited to hear from our wonderful expert guests today. Before we get started, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's president and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who is going to give some brief welcoming remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. Thanks everybody for joining us for our Supporting Innovation in Education webinar series, where we hear from experts who work at the intersection of higher education policy and philanthropy. It has been an uncertain month indeed for higher education students as some institutions roll out campus reopening plans while others make last-minute changes to their policies. Some have come back and already decided to go back home. So it's a crazy time in higher education. This is definitely a time where higher education students need support more than ever. It is very important to note that Black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students, low-income students, and rural students have been affected most of all by both the pandemic itself as well as disruptions in the higher education space. The scope of student need is huge. There are a number of different aspects that policymakers should consider addressing. We'll be talking about a few of those aspects today, including how to engage displaced workers, how to support student borrowers, and how to help students who may be at risk of food or housing insecurity. So I want to thank our friends Carol, Sarah, and Tina for making time to help expand our thinking and our understanding about what's going on in this space. And with that, I'll turn it back to James to get our conversation going. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Javed. We do want to jump right in, but before we do, just a couple of really brief housekeeping notes from me. The first is that if you'd like to follow along on social media with today's conversation, please use the hashtag #EdInnovation, and please feel free to submit questions via Twitter as well. Otherwise, the main way to submit questions for today's conversation is using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom app. Please note that we are not going to be unmuting lines at any point. So we ask that you please submit all questions through that Q&A feature. And please also note that we are currently live streaming on Facebook, if you know of anyone who would prefer to tune in that way. So now let's get started. I'd love to give each of our expert guests a chance to briefly talk about themselves and some of their work. And Carol, we'll start with you. Would love if you could talk a little bit about Strada Education Network and your role in making connections between higher education and the workforce, and also how some of that work has been affected by the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Hunt Institute for including Strada Education in this webinar, and I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues as well. Strada Education Network is a nonprofit social impact organization, and we've been at this mission of connecting education and work now for some 7 years, and we're a very different kind of organization than what you might think of in a traditional philanthropic role. We are a social impact organization, and we achieve our mission through research, through traditional philanthropy, but also we own and operate companies that are aligned with our mission of making better connections with education and work. And today, hopefully I'll talk about some of our research. One of the cornerstones of that research is talking to actual education consumers, students, prospective students, past students, gaining those insights and helping people make decisions in higher education, policymakers, philanthropists. So I'll be talking about our public Viewpoint survey that we've been doing since mid-March, and also the work we've done with Gallup over the last few years. We've interviewed some 350,000 Americans about their experiences with higher education. So I'll hope that I can contribute that to the discussion today.
Yeah, wonderful. We will look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you, Carol. Sarah, I would love to turn to you next, and would love if you could give kind of a brief overview of the Student Borrowing Success Project. Talk a little bit about your work, and in particular, how you've thought about supporting student borrowers and how their needs may have changed because of either temporary disruptions or temporary relief that's come about because of this pandemic.
Sure. So the Pew Charitable Trust has long been focused on the health and status of the American dream and family finances. And as a part of this work, in 2018, we launched the Project on Student Borrower Success, which is focused on student loan repayment and servicing from a family financial perspective. So we're really thinking about the conversations that Americans are having around the dinner table and how to ensure that families don't encounter barriers to repaying their loans. And today there are really two important issues at play. First, before the pandemic, the student loan repayment system wasn't necessarily always working for the most vulnerable borrowers. Today, we have about 43 million people with a federal student loan, but about 1 in 5 of those is in default. And before the pandemic, around 1 million people were going into default every year. And failing to repay a student loan can have some serious financial consequences for borrowers. They can face collection fees, wage garnishment, damage to their credit scores, and a host of other consequences. The second issue is that the pandemic and the related economic downturn have really taken a significant toll on both borrowers and also servicers. So some of the issues I mentioned before have been exacerbated. So for example, many borrowers have lost their jobs, and at least at the beginning of the pandemic and likely sort of throughout and later in the process, servicers have had staffing shortages and experienced high call volumes from affected borrowers. And so, of course, Congress and later the White House have acted to help mitigate these challenges by pausing payments, interest charges, and collection efforts through the end of the year. But the difficulties that borrowers and servicers are facing are likely to outlast these temporary interventions. And so early next year, tens of millions of borrowers are going to transition back into repayment at the same time. And servicers are going to need to manage that unprecedented outreach from millions as borrowers contemplate their options and sort of continue to deal with this family financial insecurity. So, what our research is really focused on is during and after the national emergency, helping policymakers gain a clear understanding of the points within the repayment process where borrowers typically lose their way and specific actions that can promote successful repayment. So I'm hoping today to talk a little bit more about what those places are, where those points of friction are, but also some ideas for policymakers to facilitate the repayment process.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. We are also looking forward to hearing more about some of those points that you raised. And Tina, would love for you to give some brief opening remarks and tell us a little bit about ACT's Center for Equity and Learning and the work that you all have been doing both before the pandemic and how you've tried to sort of meet the new reality of student needs since the pandemic.
Thank you so much, James. It's my pleasure to join my panelists today, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for the opportunity to be here. The Center for Equity and Learning is a division within ACT that was launched in 2016. It is a division within ACT that seeks to capture the ways that ACT as an organization supports learners from all backgrounds, thinks about the strategies that are needed to support students in their education and workplace journey, helping students achieve success. We often talk about our work within ACT as our mission in action. ACT is a not-for-profit organization with over 60 years of experience supporting the learning journey of young people. Many individuals associate ACT with one of our tools and solutions, which is the ACT test. But we are an organization that has a robust body of work in the learning space, social emotional learning, for example, curriculum supports. In the navigation space, how do students understand, how do individuals understand transition points between K through 12 and higher ed and the workforce. And so when you think about ACT, we are a not-for-profit organization that is about helping students achieve their education and workplace goals, dreams, and aspirations. And the Center for Equity and Learning teases out all of the work that ACT is doing and thinks critically about how are rural students affected by and impacted by our work? How are first generation students or students from low income families connecting with or seeing a forward movement in their education journey as a result of ACT's interventions? How are we as an organization partnering with the amazing thought leaders and education advocates that are making a difference for students from all walks of life? And so the center does a lot of work internal within ACT, as well as a significant work external to ACT in engaging in partnerships with those individuals that want to make a difference for those students that have often been left out, forgotten, marginalized by our current educational system. The Center for Equity and Learning this summer launched a webinar series of our own focused on many of the issues facing students in the midst of COVID-19, issues around the digital divide, issues around the realities of basic needs being disrupted, food, housing insecurities, and the like. And then a webinar focused on how students are navigating the decision to go back to higher education or not. What is the best approach for an individual thinking through the future in an online uncertain environment? And so our webinar series has brought together quite a few experts that have helped to inform how ACT shows up and how we might look to the future. That business as usual is going to be new for the future, and there is no usual right now. We are in a space where a lot of ingenuity, innovation, and then flexibility and creativity is needed. And so our experience over the last 6 to 8 months has been one of growth and pivoting to meet the needs of students and their desire for high quality educational solutions, tools, resources that will help them make it to the next stage in their educational journey. So I look forward to sharing more about what we are hearing in the field and hearing from my colleagues on this call as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina. Looking forward to hearing more takeaways from the Equity in Action webinar series. I've caught a couple of them myself, and they were really terrific conversations. So thanks to you and your team for providing that service to the field, and look forward to hearing more. And I love your line about how part of your role is to translate how policies actually impact real students. I think that's a great theme of these conversations because you all are so well plugged in, and that's a great transition to some opening questions that I'd love to ask of you all. Just quickly as a reminder, if attendees have questions, please do submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. But speaking of effects on real people, Carol, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about the public viewpoint survey that you referenced. I know that you've kind of had your finger on the pulse in terms of how people have been perceiving the value of higher education and how that perception might have evolved throughout the last few months as we've seen all these disruptions and development. So could you spend a few minutes talking about some of the high-level takeaways from the survey responses you've been seeing, and in turn, how that has informed how you and your team think about how to help students such as displaced workers during this time?
Yes, thank you. I love the theme that you all settled on. That's what real people are actually thinking and going through. And like ACT, we've been doing the webinars as well, having people, policymakers and people in the field react to what Americans are thinking. So we know a lot about how Americans have reacted since mid-March to COVID and their perceptions about higher education. We know that about 25% of all Americans think they want to go back to school to either reskill or upskill. And we know that Black Americans, Latinos want to go back in higher numbers and percentages than white Americans. So we have to have an education system that really accommodates a lot of people coming in. But also, those are populations that our traditional higher education has not had the greatest success with. So we need to think about doing things differently with those large numbers coming in. We also know that most of those folks do not necessarily want a degree. In fact, most of them do not. They want some education and skills, but they are not necessarily wanting to pursue a degree right now. Lots of reasons for that. It's a high risk to put a lot of time and money into a degree program when you don't know what the job or the career is at the end of that path. And also the uncertainty of the delivery of higher education, as you said at the beginning, it's really rocky, the delivery right now, whether it's online or in person. We also know, and this had gotten a lot of attention a few weeks ago, that when asked about the barriers, what really stops people from pursuing those ambitions, that the number one reason that they are hesitant to engage in post-secondary education was self-doubt that they could be successful. It wasn't cost. In fact, that was third. It was the self-doubt. Can I really do this? And then the second one was, is it going to be flexible enough for me to meet my lifestyle? Adults right now are juggling a lot. Their own children at home, trying either to work or find a job, worried about what's going to happen with unemployment if that's what they're on, or what's going to happen with their jobs. Still a very high percentage of people are worried that they're going to lose their own jobs. And then you ask them about pursuing education, and it's a lot to take on right now. And so how is our higher education system really accommodating this population, which they didn't do that great of a job to begin with, and now it's very complicated. So those are a few of the findings. I can talk a lot about it because we've asked a lot of people a lot of questions, but those might give enough to get the conversation going.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll be able to weave in some other responses throughout the conversation. So thank you, Carol. And Sarah, a lot of the things that Carol just talked about in terms of juggling work schedules and unexpected childcare duties and seeking to or upskill because of job loss or income reduction. For student borrowers who hold student loan debt, there's yet another layer of complexity and difficulty that folks like that have to deal with. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how student loan repayment and servicing plays into this kind of perfect storm of uncertainty that many students are facing. And you talked a little bit earlier about what some policymakers can be doing to think about supporting this population, especially as you mentioned, their temporary relief is going to expire pretty soon. So we'd love if you could just kind of expand on those points a little bit more.
Sure. So we recently conducted focus groups with more than 150 borrowers in 8 cities across the country and really mapped what we heard from these borrowers with some more quantitative work we had done previously. And really 3 themes stood out to us that are most relevant to the current situation. So first, financial insecurity drives borrower repayment behavior, which I think is most sort of closely aligned with what Carol was talking about. Income-driven repayment or IDR plans are difficult for many borrowers to access. And third, borrowers face challenges and confusion around points of transition and repayment. So I'll just dig a little bit into each of these, 3 key points. First, the financial insecurity. So borrowers consistently reported to us that economic shocks, including job loss, unexpected health problems, natural disasters, issues with childcare, etc., were the biggest barriers to repayment. And that the repayment challenges they were facing were really the result of unexpected expenses and budgets that were already stretched to and beyond the breaking point. And borrowers are experiencing many challenges like these today, right? We did these focus groups before the pandemic, but these are highly relevant themes. Many said they were unable to make payments, but they really wanted to. And, before the pandemic, many even took on another job to help make up the difference, which is something that might not be an option today. So second, IDR plans tie monthly payments to family size and income and can make payments more affordable for many, especially in times of financial stress, again, like today. We know that borrowers enrolled in these plans experience delinquency and default at lower levels than people in other plans. But the focus group participants we talked to really reported that these plans were difficult to enroll and remain in part because of the complex annual application and recertification process. And though a recently passed federal law has the potential to really help streamline this, it hasn't been implemented. There are tons of other challenges. So this tool that we really want people to be using is one of the most complex things for them to do. And third, the transition to transition points within the repayment system can create challenges. So borrowers said they experience confusion managing the repayment process, were likely to fall off track in these transition points, such as when they were entering repayment, when they were exiting periods of past payments, and when they were enrolling in income-driven plans. And so we're seeing, again, a sort of a perfect storm of that now, right? There is a group of borrowers who recently left school. Maybe they graduated, maybe they dropped out or stopped out to deal with other family obligations. So that's a transition point. We're seeing people are going to be coming off of these pause payments in the next couple of months. And we're seeing that, we may want many of these people to enroll in IDR plans, but those are complex. So it's important to really think about this because, as I mentioned before, the tools that are available to help borrowers manage financial stress aren't working as intended, and borrowers are and will continue to experience financial insecurity. And so these are sort of factors that build on and exacerbate each other. And while understanding sort of how all of these pieces play together and how the role of student loans play in family finances was incredibly important before the pandemic, it's even more crucial. So I'll just sort of mention some of the policy solutions we're advocating for, and then can dig into the specifics of them, throughout the conversation. So we're really thinking about ways to help reduce barriers and confusion, address the needs of different types of borrowers, right? So some folks may be doing fine, may not have lost their jobs, may not be experiencing the same sort of negative impacts of the recession and pandemic than others, and then some groups may be. And so thinking about how to right-size those solutions. And then ensure ease of implementation. So if servicers and others sort of can't implement the pieces of these reforms, they're not actually going to be reaching borrowers and be as effective as possible. So some of the key things that we are talking about is first, automatically extending deadlines for re-enrolling in these income-driven repayment plans, especially will be helpful for borrowers who can maintain their current payments, but there's just a lot of stuff going on, a lot of confusion. It will help sort of facilitate the process. When everyone re-enters repayment, it'll allow servicers to really hone in and focus on borrowers who are struggling most. Second, making it easier, especially for borrowers who've experienced reductions in income, to enroll and recertify for these plans. Third, facilitating a robust outreach campaign for borrowers. The department is, already doing a ton here, but really thinking about how to maximize all of the research and things that we know to target people when and where they might need more assistance. And then fourth, create some additional flexibility for when this wave of borrowers re-enters repayment. So for example, if someone misses their first payment or first couple of payments right out of the gate, that's a sign that maybe there's something else at play. It could be that someone is still experiencing financial insecurity and can't afford their payments and couldn't or don't know about enrolling in these income-driven plans. But it could also be a borrower who was previously enrolled in an automatic payment, like an auto debit arrangement, and somehow maybe they changed their bank account or it didn't get sort of put in place. And so there are some issues maybe for people who are doing okay too that might need some tinkering around the edges.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Bunch of very useful information there. I love the idea of using particular indicators to dig deeper, as we've talked about kind of the intersectionality of need that so many people are facing, and figuring out what might else be going on and what are the supports they might benefit from. I think that's a really great idea in terms of collaborating and leveraging our strengths and working together to support students. We've got a couple questions coming in. For the rest of you who have not yet submitted one, please do use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but apologize in advance if we're not able to get to yours. But before we pivot to there, Tina, I wanted to ask you if you could kind of expand on what you teed up earlier in terms of the great programming that you all have been running all summer, and some of the high-level takeaways that you have realized as a result of these conversations when it comes to kind of attempting to mitigate the effects that these disruptions might have on some equity gaps among higher education students. So I'd love if you could just talk a little bit more about what you've been learning.
Thanks so much, James. I want to pause and share that in the course of our webinar series this summer, we heard time and time again that this is a COVID season where, yes, we have a pandemic, but we are also seeing individuals struggling with the trauma of social injustice, racial injustice, also dealing with the trauma of mass unemployment. So when we think about this season, it is not just one driver of uncertainty. It is multiple drivers of uncertainty, of trauma, of difficulty that students and their families are facing. So when we are looking at different topics, so one being the issue of the digital divide, what comes to the fore is, one, there was already a digital divide before these multiple issues came together and were exacerbated for families. So what we're seeing is just a further difficulty that individuals and their families are having to face. But if you unpack that digital divide, it's not just that everyone doesn't have the same type of access to technology infrastructure, whether it be broadband or wireless access or actual tools. It could also be the realities of family and in-home dynamics that make it very difficult for you to have a quiet space in order to participate in an online environment. We hear stories of students having to participate from their car or having to participate from the restroom as the only place where they can find quiet and solitary space for any type of academic engagement. What we know is that even when we have communities where there is an expectation that there would be technology available, that it is spotty based on your zip code, that once again, low-income individuals are further challenged by the lack of our national, perhaps state, perhaps community infrastructure that is still not meeting all of the needs of our U.S. population as a whole. And so some of the things that we are learning is that our first-generation students, Latinx students, students from African-American backgrounds, students in rural communities, students from low-income communities are just experiencing the same trauma that they had before these multiple moments of intersecting difficulty and are now just seeing it heightened. And when we think about solutions that are working, we've heard from leaders that have been overwhelmed by volunteers in their local community providing food and providing space and providing free counseling for families. What we know is sometimes the time away at school is a moment of reprieve for family dynamics that can sometimes be struggling. And if we don't have that moment of reprieve, if we don't have that moment where everyone can kind of get some outside perspective, what we find is that there are extra challenges. ACT has a robust set of solutions and supports that we have provided for free during the last 5 months for many communities that we have supported teachers in accessing, because what we also have experienced in the last 5 months is that everyone had to get up to speed on new interventions to support the needs of first-generation low-income students of color. We didn't have the luxury of 2 years of planning. So one of the opportunities that ACT has been pleased to be able to provide is short-term relief, short-term support, short-term encouragement and resources and opportunities for teachers and students and families to get the wraparound support they need. We've heard from individuals like Sarah Goldrick-Rab at the Hope Center that does significant research on food insecurity, housing insecurity, and financial insecurity that students on their way to college are facing, and recognizing that the residence halls are a place that can be a place of security for students. And if institutions are still struggling with whether they can open the residence halls or keep them open or have students there full time, we know that we are going to see trauma and see difficulty faced by more students who don't have that as a safety net in the midst of uncertainty. So what we have heard is, one, that individuals who were already experiencing difficulty are just now having to reach out and get a lot more support because it's nothing new, it's just more fire underneath the challenges that students were already facing. And we are seeing organizations, school districts, universities make outsized decisions to support their students, to provide food for students that don't have access to food, to provide housing for students that, when you think about former foster youth that have nowhere else to go, we see universities making the choice to create space for students even when the university is closed down. So we know that there are leaders out there that are going the extra mile, but we are still in a time of difficulty. And what we heard is the creativity, the innovation, and the flexibility that students have experienced has made all the difference.
Thank you so much, Gina. That's such helpful context for all of us to keep in mind, but especially for policymakers and institution leaders who are thinking about these campus-wide or statewide decisions and maybe need a little bit of prodding to make sure they're taking into account the actual needs of students and how those things intersect. And love Sarah Goldrick-Robb's work. We're big fans. I think it's moved that conversation forward in a very important way. So thanks for flagging her as well. So we've got some comments and questions that I'd love to get to now. One of the first questions we got is kind of building off of some comments that Carol made, but I'd love to give each of you a chance to respond to it. And the person asks, given the apprehension about a four-year degree and maybe what that takes at this point, has there been an increased focus on credentialing for adult learners who are looking to make career transitions? So I guess Carol would love if you could maybe unpack a little bit more about what you're hearing in terms of people who are seeking some shorter term credentialing programs and what's out there in terms of options for them.
Thank you. Yes, as I said, most people right now prefer non-degree options. They prefer to go to their local community college, so stay local, whether it's online or at the local college. So we work with a lot of states and a lot of communities through our philanthropy and through our solutions like MZ that does a lot of labor market analytics, really helping to unpack what are the real jobs that are available now, what are the skills needed for those jobs, and helping states and communities think about the policies that are going to allow students to really understand those opportunities, but also where the funding comes from for those shorter term education and training programs, since Pell is not available to them. So a lot of states are using either their CARE dollars or finding other resources that really helps people finance those shorter term credential-based opportunities that lead to jobs that are going to be available, that are still available. There are a lot of job openings right now. And there are a lot of people who have lost their jobs, and it's helping people make that match, but also helping to facilitate people going into those short-term training programs. A lot of the states that we support, like Indiana, Rhode Island, Louisiana, are all putting in programs that really help people access the finances for those shorter-term degree opportunities, shorter-term non-degree opportunities.
Thanks, Carol, and that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask Sarah to weigh in on, which is kind of the financing aspect, as you mentioned. I know, Sarah, that a debate at the federal level has been whether or not to expand Pell eligibility to short-term credentialing programs like the ones we're talking about. And I know that the folks who oppose that move have expressed concern that if there are not strong quality controls in place, there might not be a strong return on investment for students. And obviously, you're very focused on student loan debt and making sure that students take out loans for the right reasons. So Sarah, would just love if you could weigh in on the fact that we are going to see a surge in demand for some of these short-term credentialing programs, and what does that mean from the financing side of things in terms of what might be debated as possible next steps?
Sure. I think what is really, really important is the connection with what we call the front end. So the access, the equity, the cost, the completion, and the back end, which is the repayment. And, we know that sort of no matter what degree someone completes or if they don't complete, people who struggle to repay their loans are most likely to question returning to school, recommending that others go to school, and the value of a college degree and sort of helping boost economic mobility. So we're really thinking about student loan repayment as something where when that extends, when people struggle, when it ends up costing them more, that really makes a college education cost more. It just, sort of happens on the back end, but it makes it cost more for folks who often can least afford it. So we're really, as part of these debates and as this conversation is going on about how people pay for school, how demand for various programs and how people do fund them is changing both in general before the pandemic, but also, what is happening as a result, thinking about making sure these pieces are connected, that we're not just thinking about how people access and fund things right before they go to school, but we're thinking about that sort of through the life course, through when they finish, and making sure that any loans they do take out, there are systems in place to ensure that they face a reduced number of barriers in repayment.
Thanks, Sarah. Tina, anything you'd like to add on this question about short-term credentialing programs and whether they might be a good solution for folks seeking a re or upskill?
So the only thing that I would add is as we're thinking about students of color and first-generation students, counseling and advising for them around the credential space is very important because we know that 2-year and 4-year degrees have labor market value, and some credentials also have strong labor market value and others do not. So when we're thinking about supporting individuals on their academic journey, not all credentials are created equal, just as not all degrees are created equal. And assisting individuals who may not have two parents that got degrees or understand all of the nuances of credentials, or may not have a brother or cousin that can help walk them through. If we're going to encourage the adults, comebackers, those who have been displaced because of unemployment, to make decisions, smart decisions around credentials that can be stacked towards degrees, that can be connected with future degrees, that are part of institutions or part of structures where it doesn't lead to a dead end, but leads to further a workplace advancement and further educational advancement. I would just suggest that the credential space has a lot of opportunity, but it is most successful when it's paired with counseling and transparent support and that one-on-one connection for the individual as they're trying to navigate and make thoughtful and successful decisions, not for the right now, or not only for the right now, but for their future.
Thanks, Tina. Extremely helpful context. You're right that credentialing does provide a lot of opportunities, but you're also very correct in saying that we want to make sure those opportunities do not exacerbate equity gaps, but that they're used to lessen them. So thanks for that helpful context. We have a couple of folks who have asked kind of a variety of questions about the digital divide, which I'd love to give you all a chance to weigh in on in terms of how it affects our ability to support students and help them repay their loans and everything like that. One question was specifically about the federal government's role in expanding broadband access versus the state role that can be played. But another question was kind of just more generally about how, for students affected by the digital divide, this is yet another burden on top of everything we've already talked about. Maybe they are ready to go to school and fill out the FAFSA, but they can't really access their IRS form on their mobile device without broadband internet, or maybe they're thinking about signing up for classes, but the library isn't open for them to look at their course schedule. So I'd love to give you each an opportunity, and we'll do the same order, to talk a little bit about how the digital divide plays into some of these issues that we've been talking about. So Carol, we'll start with you.
Yeah, probably Tina probably is more the expert on this. I will say that we haven't asked a lot about the digital divide in our surveys, but we do ask a lot about how people perceive online education. So maybe my contribution could be that. People, by and large, are favorable toward online. They prefer a more hybrid approach, but they are favorable to online. Black Americans and Latinos are more favorable about online. Maybe it's because, could be a lot of reasons for that. Could be a lot of health concerns about in-person, and there's some indication of that. But here's the thing, they are not confident that employers value the online. And so I think that going forward, if online is still going to be a very big part of the delivery of post-secondary education, we've got to get employers engaged to signal that they value it to the same degree that they would any other kind of degree. And so it could be a real limiting factor of people who want online, have access to it, but are concerned that it's not valued out in the marketplace. So that's not really digital divide, but that's my contribution to the discussion based on what we've asked about.
And it's very helpful. I know that while we were looking into institutions trying to hold courses that required some sort of in-person component online, I know there were a couple of industry efforts to share training resources and other things that they use with their own employees. So it's been encouraging to see that the desire is there on the side of the business community to help inform some of these online programs and make sure that they are of the highest quality possible. Sarah, how does the digital divide affect some of the student borrowing and repayment issues that you've talked about? And is it a challenge for servicers to reach some students who are maybe stuck at home without broadband access, or what are some other challenges that this particular aspect poses?
Sure. So one of the things that is really important to know is that the Department of Education is working on a host of reforms and edits and changes to how information is presented to students, how the tools available to help students walk through and understand the types of loans they have and their options for repayment. And a lot of this is very necessarily online, right? So when students don't have reliable access, it can be harder for them to understand their options. Certainly they can always call their servicer, they can call the department, there are other ways to reach out, but seeing some of that stuff side by side, really being able to make comparisons, understanding maybe some projections of how long it will take you to repay or going through your options can just be a lot easier online. It can be done 24 hours a day. And so folks who don't have access to technology, to broadband, to, various types of devices are certainly at a disadvantage in terms of understanding all of their options.
Yet another way that those folks might be disadvantaged. Tina, I know you're ready to jump in, and you did a whole webinar on this, so you could probably take the rest of our time sharing all of your insight, but would love for you to weigh in here as well.
No, I really appreciate what Carol and Sarah have already shared. What we know is in different times during our history, our states and our federal government leadership has come together during the space program, during the time that highways were developed. We know that we can rally together. So your original question of how the federal government and how state leaders might look at this issue of the digital divide. We are in a knowledge economy. We are focused on being a global participant, and access to broadband, access to the internet, access to technology, how to navigate it, how to understand it, how to be expert in it is essential not only for our local community strength and our national community strength, but our global participation. So if ever there was a time for us to come together with the same level of energy that we saw at the time that we made our moonshot commitment, or the time when we developed our interstate highway system, now is the time for the collaboration. We have what is it? They say never let a good crisis moment go to waste. If there was an incentive for addressing digital divide, now is the time for it. We have so many pieces of evidence that signal that we have education challenges, absolutely. We have workplace challenges. Those that are have been able to navigate the storm of COVID-19 in terms of their employment have been individuals that have been able to work from home, or individuals that were able to access technology for transforming the way that they work. As we think about the future of artificial intelligence and the engagement of the workforce with this new and amazing, very robust tool of artificial intelligence, individuals that are able to access and understand and innovate within a digital space, within a digital conversation, will be those that fare better. But our state and our federal leaders have an opportunity to make sure that our entire U.S. population can access with the same level of fairness that is part of the American ethos, all of the technology resources that are needed for the future. 2060 is actually right around the corner. People think about it as far away, but we are building now for the success of the U.S. economy, for the success of our engaged civic individual, for the success of global participation now. And highways and space exploration were the exciting areas of the past. Our current exciting area is addressing digital divide, and partnership is what is required.
Tina, that was such a wonderful call to action that part of me just wants to end the webinar right here, but we still have some more time, and I want to give you all a chance to offer some closing thoughts, but thank you very much. That's an extremely helpful and thoughtful response. So we've got just over 10 minutes left, and we have a question from Dr. Crone in the audience, which kind of lines up with what I wanted to close with anyway, which is nice and convenient. But Dr. Crone asks, and I'm hoping that you can talk about a little bit in terms of more of the medium and long-term implications of this pandemic. You know, I love the line Tina just referenced about can't let a good crisis go to waste. You know, we've talked a lot about how many of the disruptions caused by the pandemic have exposed or magnified inequities that already existed in our system. And so as we reflect on that, and as maybe we pick our heads up and try to think beyond the immediate term for just a moment or two, I'd love if you all could talk about what opportunities might be in front of us to rethink some of the systems that are in place that previously produced these inequities. How does the pandemic give us an opportunity to think about new ways of serving students in ways that might produce more equitable outcomes for everyone going forward? So we'll do the same order on responses to this one, and Carol, we'll start with you.
Thank you. You know, it's such a great question, and we do a lot of thinking about that. You know, I think this era that we're in is the first time that I really feel like everyone is focused on really trying to understand what Americans want and value from their education system and how best to serve them. It's becoming very customer focused, if you allow me to use that word, in a way that I've not seen before. And when I think about higher education, you know, I'm looking at K-12, and the K-12 system has been so disrupted. And I'm hearing a lot about how these innovations are popping up in K-12, these micro schools, which, you know, we didn't have those before COVID, learning pods, you know, where parents are getting together and you know, making arrangements for their children. And so K-12 is actually, I think, doing some really interesting, innovative things to really try to meet and help with parents and children. On the higher ed side, I think it remains to be seen their long-term response to this. You know, certainly some colleges are not going to make it, and that's going to be very disruptive for them and for their students. But in terms of disrupting the model, I think now's the time to really do that. to think about all of the reasons why it was not successful for many, many students, the traditional model, and how we think about how people get advice, how you make it relevant to their lives, how you make it faster, less costly, more affordable for more people, more accessible. And I think, I don't know if this is going to result in a very fast permanent reset for higher ed. It's been disruptive, that is for sure. But will the basic model be disrupted long-term in a way that consumers want it? They do want it in shorter bites. They do want it more affordable. They do want it more flexible to their lifestyle. And they do want it more friendly, so that the self-doubt isn't the first thing that is getting in their way. And so I think there's lots of opportunity for higher education to really redo their model. And I think, though, to be perfectly honest, me speaking here, as the disclaimer, this does not necessarily affect the management and leadership of Strada Education. But I think it remains to be seen how fast they can disrupt themselves for the consumer. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Tina, what do you think?
That made a lot of sense, and you're getting a thumbs up from Tina, so I think she agrees. Yeah, thank you, Carol. That's very helpful. We will hope that folks take advantage of the opportunity as swiftly as they're able to, but I think you're right to flag that it won't happen automatically. Sarah, would love if you could respond to this medium and long-term question and talk a little bit about opportunities to rethink student loan borrowing and servicing.
Sure. So, there are really three things I want to highlight here. First, the importance of longer-term reform to the student loan repayment system. The focus groups we did and some of our other research really provide lessons for implementing structural changes, which together with the temporary provisions enacted during the pandemic can help meet the longer-term needs of those struggling with with delinquency and default. So the idea being, what lessons are we learning during the pandemic? What are we seeing that is working for borrowers and not? And how can we incorporate that into some longer-term structural change? Second, we have some information about people who were struggling before the pandemic, and our focus should absolutely be on serving those folks. But the pandemic will also create a new group of strugglers in the student loan repayment space, for lack of a better term. And we need to work to identify who those borrowers are and connect them with solutions. So, higher education is still an incredibly important pathway toward upward economic mobility for many. And student loans are an important access tool, but as I mentioned before, people who have difficulty repaying and difficulty navigating the repayment system are more likely to question the value of loans and helping to facilitate higher education. And third, which is something that has been mentioned a couple times throughout the webinar, the importance of student loans as only one piece of a larger reform from an equity perspective. So we know that for a host of reasons, including systemic, structural, and interpersonal racism, the pandemic is hitting communities of color, particularly African Americans, really hard. We also know that the same group already has higher rates of default than other borrowers. And there's certainly a role for the repayment system to play in ensuring that any borrowers at risk of delinquency and default have access to affordable plans. But this really is a multifaceted issue, a multifaceted problem, and needs a multifaceted solution. So again, research indicates that African Americans have fewer resources for college, borrow more, and experience disparate labor market outcomes. And so that sort of larger problem needs solutions that include but are not just limited to student loan repayment. And thinking about sort of how can we link together a lot of the ideas we've talked about today to ensure equity across the life cycle of someone in higher education.
Thanks, Sarah. I love that idea of thinking holistically about student need and equity and making sure that the response is comprehensive as well. And that's a great segue into Tina. Tina, would love if you could provide some thoughts on medium and long-term opportunities and areas that you see as potentially things that you might be optimistic about in terms of changing the system for the better.
Thanks so much, James. When we think about the current demographic of a student going into higher education, we have a population of students that are traditional age, that are 18, but the majority of our students are adult learners, students who are independent, students who have dependents, whether it's parents or children that they are supporting, students that are working either part-time or full-time. The demographic of a student right now is a student that is carrying quite a few expectations and responsibilities as they also navigate their educational experience. What we also know is that as we move forward, more of the student population will be Black and Brown, will be African American, Latinx, students from indigenous backgrounds. And we know that traditionally higher education has not achieved the outcomes that we aspire to when we look at the realities facing African American, Latinx, and other students of color. So given what we know from the past and what we know about the future, the current opportunity is, one, recognize that we are serving students that are carrying many different responsibilities, and institutions that are able to pivot and provide flexibility, weekend, evening, lots of access to the educational experience when the student is ready and able to access it, not necessarily when the faculty member is able and willing and interested in bringing it forward. It's kind of let's meet each other in closer to the middle. Being more student-friendly is an expectation, is a requirement for the now, and will continue to be a requirement for the future. We know that higher education has room to grow, but we also know that in the midst of COVID-19, many institutions may not, as Carol already rightly identified, may not make it. That the business model for the way that higher education is currently structured doesn't make all institutions viable for the future. There was a really great question in the chat box about how are HBCUs faring and how are HBCUs serving African American students in particular. And what we see are the HBCUs that are being creative, that are being innovative, that are really thinking through the student-first model are the HBCUs where students continue to thrive, places like Howard University or Morehouse University or Spelman as a few examples. We know that there are others, but as HBCUs are having to wrestle with a new model, wrestle with a student population that has many demands, all other institutions will need to look creatively as well. So our short term is to recognize that we have a different student than we might have had back in the 1960s, even now, and that student population is going to continue to grow as we look to the future. It is exciting for me that with this COVID-19 experience, we are all doing a lot better job at online learning than we were before COVID-19. Many traditional institutions were saying, oh, that's not part of our model, that's not part of our DNA, that's not how we define a high quality education. Well, we're now having to rethink that there is such a thing as high quality online education. And for the future, we are going to see those institutions that will remain viable, that will remain successful, will be those that tap into exactly what high quality online education looks like. It is meeting the needs of students where they are. It is recognizing that perhaps it will be a lower cost experience over the long term. And it is realizing that we are part of a knowledge economy and we have to move to the future or go the way of the dinosaurs. This is a creative opportunity for higher education to tap into its ingenuity and creativity for servicing students better, putting student outcomes first, and then making a difference where it counts. I don't know whether that gives a full roadmap of what institutions may or may not do. My sense is that we have a lot of hope ahead of us, and I want to be part of the solutions that get more first-generation, low-income students of color across the finish line for our global success and our U.S. success.
What a wonderful way to wrap things up. Tina, thank you so much for ending us on a hopeful note. I love the idea of moving towards a more student-centered system of higher education, especially taking into account the number of students of color and Indigenous students and low-income students and rural students who will need our support over the coming years. Definitely important to keep front and center as we think about moving forward. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to extend many thanks again to our expert panelists for joining us and sharing their insight. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Just a quick note about some upcoming programming that we will have ready for you shortly. On Thursday of this week, we're going to have another webinar conversation with Lieutenant Governors from Kentucky and Nevada, and they'll be joined by Mike Petrilli of the Fordham Institute. And then a week from today, Tuesday, September 1st, we'll have another webinar on early childhood philanthropy, amidst COVID-19. And as a reminder, the Hunt Institute does have a COVID-19 landing page with a bunch of great resources for policymakers. So that's it for us. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on a Hunt Institute webinar soon.